Okay. Welcome, dis and dat, 17 November. Sorry, we're a couple minutes late. All righty then. We will, of course, continue with this a little bit. We may shift back to the other things that we were looking at, Dussel, for example. But we're up to kind of the things that are necessary or interesting. Cellis bueno on attention. Chapter 2, we were looking at chapter 1 last week. The point that I'm sort of fiddling around with is the problem, of course, of distinguishing between questions of how we get to surplus value, whether how rooted it is in issues of labor. Fortunately, what we've been able to do is look at the difference between labor, living labor, and labor power. One is more abstract than the other, but I think by the time we get through today, hopefully we'll see that it is less about while it's important to consider the labor theory of value, we aren't totally tied to it, particularly well in the case of this particular text, we get into works by eventually the thing gets into Hart and Negri and Deleuze and Guattari, etc. And what we're trying to do is, in fact, reconcile the kind of developments that have occurred, for example, in uh, not only in talking about, for example, the Olivetti factory, the studies of the Olivetti factory in the 1960s, I think, and other matters that kind of impinge on that. But anyway, the advent of post-Fordism, however, labor time becomes an obsolete form of measure. The time century is over, and this sort of speaks to the issue that it's not about well, the goal, I think, is to find a way in which value can be measured, and getting at that and ultimately getting to the issue of surplus value. Uh, One might think that, okay, various ways in which we can look at time as one measurement for, socially necessary labor time, etc. Um, that seemed viable up through World War II. But after World War II, we get what um, this particular text talks about in terms of thinking about what is sort of Fordian and post-Fordian labor time, and that the point coming from this is that it would be difficult, or it's not a fool's errand by any means, but to depend more on issues of time when it's even more difficult. I mean, time is still important, right, in terms of measuring activity. But when we think about the difference between unpaid um, or fixed and variable, uh, the ways in which we can think about capital, for example, and ultimately do get to rent, there's a kind of long way around that, but I think it's still important to consider, particularly on certain key issues related to the difference between absolute and relative. Um, other issues that come up in the second point here, in order to preserve its command, capitalism demands a constant cancellation of the time of liberation. That is, it has created through the reproduction of a time of domination. So we can see this kind of interesting dichotomy between liberation and domination. And of course, in this book on attention, we get sort of the front end of that version. It allows us to consider some of the issues that related to not only surplus value, but a whole bunch of other things. More importantly, though, do we commit to some issue about labor, and does your commitment to that create a kind of problem, ultimately a theoretical problem or a problem of praxis? So, but I think that the idea of an attention economy, which allows us to consider all those things that might be called, for example, cognitive capitalism, et cetera, it gives us a means by which we can sort of study some of that, and at least gives us some new terms to sort of work with. The attention economy can be understood as a concrete mechanism aimed at reproducing the systematic cancellation of the time of liberation created by the technical transformations of industrial processes, and in doing so, reproducing the time of capitalist domination. So by turning every aspect of life into a source of valorization information, and hence into a form of immaterial labor. So we've introduced a new kind of labor, or you could call it immaterial, you could call it intangible. I think that's a more capitalist way of thinking about it. The attention economy subsumes the enormous productive powers unleashed by post-Fordism within the homogeneous logic of surplus value. So if it does this, how is it that we can measure it? Is it measurable? I would assert that it's measurable, not directly. That I think that it has a variety of indirect means by which we can measure it, and some of that has to do with the types of activity, with thinking about how is it that we can get to measurement eventually. So the attention economy does in fact exploit labor, but not in the traditional sense. Not in the traditional sense of expropriating a portion of the working day. It does so by means of appropriating the general intellect, the collective knowledge produced day and night, with a single micro decision of men, women, and children that cybernetic machines record, process, and feed back into the valorization cycle of capital. Now, what does all that mean? Well, it is the point that's made by others, and that is that there's a specific kind of role that that general intellect helps to describe. Now, measuring the general intellect, that's kind of where Marx goes, well, I don't think we can quantify it quite in that way. But in fact, now that we have things like the internet, et cetera, there is something measurable about it, or ways in which we can measure it. So in doing so, the revolutionary promises of technological development are negated, and the empire of the value form reproduced. So there's a lot going on in here, and simultaneously we're sort of commenting on the difference between tech development and value form. So in this context, the traditional categories that inform Marx's critique of political economy and his labor theory of value become insufficient for the task of conceptualizing the internal relation between temporality and power that defines the attention economy. So this is that problem that the immaterial, the intangible, the unpaid, all that kind of intersects. Now, whether his attempt to sort of answer what is it that goes on, particularly in a televisual or cinematic way, that's in the subsequent chapters, you know, that attention is sold as a commodity, but what does that mean? I mean, how is it as a commodity sort of expressed, and ultimately is it that we can get to surplus value? We get to value and then to surplus value on top of that. So I pulled out, those are some front end comments. Um, here's a set of notes that come up in chapter 2. According to Antonio Negri, the transformation, and note, of course, that people like Negri are following on an entire tradition of certain approaches to, labor questions, among others. Antonio Negri, the transformations put forth by post-Fordism has raised a series of questions regarding the validity of Marx's labor theory of value. So, Marx's labor theory of value has been the object of extensive criticism from both, this is footnote 35, Marx's labor theory has been the object of extensive criticism from both supporters and rejectors of Marxist thought. See, for example, Sraffa's, magnum opus, I suppose, The Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities of 1960, and Ian Steedman's text, Marx After Sraffa of 1977. Now, given the fact that the labor theory of value plays such a central role in Marx's Capital, the book, its crisis could be interpreted as a crisis of Marxist thought in general, and it's a main proof of the inadequacy of its analysis. Other authors more sympathetic to Marxism have asked what would be left of Marxist thought if the labor theory of value were removed from it. See, for example, Hodgson of 1991. And this is a key element. I mean, it is a kind of litmus test or a shibboleth, and one needs to sort of work through how you're going to answer the question. So, for example, Negri's critique of the labor theory of value and his return to the Grundrisse, also important. David Harvey comes back to it, a variety of other folks. And note, of course, that the Grundrisse is, not a late work, more like an early work, but sort of on the cusp of things, particularly since it, never saw the light of day within the context of developing larger Marxist thought. And so by the time it does get discovered, as it were, its effect partially is because it's it's ground less trod on, but it is a way in which we can think that we can believe in certain ideas, like the so-called general intellect. What would that look like? What is that, and how does it create value? So, in Negri's words, he's looking for a Marx beyond the labor theory of value, a Marx beyond Marx. And we'll look at more of this soon on Negri's part. Contrary to this, George Kafensis suggests that Negri's criterion for accepting or rejecting parts of Marx's theory is useless because it simply espoused excising the whole value discourse from the usable part of Marx's canon, and thus threatened to eliminate nearly everything in it. Furthermore, Kafensis argues that the concept of subsumption, to which Negri gives so much importance to, is inseparable from the quantity that he rejects in the labor theory of value. So subsumption still requires us to consider, because there is something called a formal subsumption, which is sort of attending to this set of transfers, the structure of things. And then there is, sort of real subsumption that is part of this larger circuit that winds up, creating valorizing, right? So all of these things are still there, and so it's not ironic so much as we need now to find better ways with which we can measure things that are perhaps either conditioned by time, but also by effect or by power, as as is mentioned in this text. So, and then I pulled note 38. Marx, however, introduces an important innovation to Ricardo's theory of value. The measure of the value of a commodity, Marx argues, does not simply depend on the amount of labor time. This is what I was just talking about. Does not simply depend on the amount of labor time spent by an individual producer, but on the average of socially necessary labor time. So it's less to look for numbers than it is to see that there is some construction that one can refer to, because it is, it's not simply time, but it is labor time, and it is a time that is also socially necessary. So Michael Heinrich notes, yeah, darn it, that this last argument, that is the value of a commodity, depends on the average of socially necessary labor time. In other words, that there is that which structures value is contingent on or constructed with or by the average of socially necessary labor time. Now, is labor time identical to our discussion of the difference between lived labor and labor power? The kind of potentiality or capacity, which is the key element of the moving to abstraction, that is, of allowing oneself to get not so much bogged down in material objects as it is to consider the structural argument which this signifies. So anyway, he contends that most Marxists incorrectly interpret this law as the core of Marx's labor theory of value. If this were the case, he adds, Marx's value theory would not have gone very far beyond classical political economy. Conversely, Heinrich argues that the core of Marx's law of value has to be found in his analysis of the fetishism of the commodity form. So the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at different versions of how to consider the fetishism problem, because that comes at the front end of Capital, right? The book. That is this idea of not only is it an issue about the commodity, but that commodity fetishism, the connection between the two becomes important as well in terms of developing um, a model of the economy. From this perspective, Marx, his law of value is less about the measure of labor and more about the concrete mechanisms through which this measure is imposed. So it's not it's less about measuring labor from that perspective, and the concrete mechanism through which this measure is imposed as a certain form of rationality to which all individuals must adhere if they wish to maintain their existence within the given conditions of society. So certain forms of rationality, and I think one can begin to look at Soren Mao's work, a variety of other works in using this as a critique or frame. So in this sense, he claims that the value theory aims at uncovering a specific social structure that individuals must conform to regardless of what they think. Now, in looking at this as a kind of aggregation or collection, it is also about accumulation, defining or constructing accumulation. So anyway, that's where I think, without overindulging Heinrich on value form, I think that's what's going on. So anyway, those are some snippets from further on in the Cellis Bueno text. And so I also included, because this is the key element, is the question of surplus. What that many discussions tend to overemphasize the kind of to reify what a surplus is. In other words, if extra stuff gets created, you can call it that, but it's less about the individual things than the whole issue of a kind of structure of, for example, in this case, wealth. This is from Carter's unfinished manuscript, which is a larger discussion on post-Strophian matters. Anyway, the social surplus is defined generally as a quantum of wealth, value, and or product over and above that necessary for a social system to reproduce itself. In this sense, it can be conceived as the residual after the societal necessaries have been properly accounted for and deducted out of total end of the period gross output. So the idea that it is a residual from an aggregation is actually kind of important. Is it the fact then, from an indexical point of view, that the residuals are the means by which we measure it, and they are by no means identical to, rent or interest or those kinds of things, but rather it is just simply the statistical residual. But anyway, letting A stand for these societal necessaries at the beginning of the round of social reproduction are subset as the surplus Y can be seen as resulting. A stands for social necessaries at the beginning of the round of social reproduction, T subset 0, and Q stand for total gross output emergent at the end of this round. The surplus Y can be seen as resulting from the difference between Q and A. Now, this simplistic interpretation is depicted in figure 1, which I've included here. So figure 1, societal reproduction and the social surplus as a residual of the, social surplus would form the kind of, or signify the residual on the activity itself. This is the, we could call it slop or something else. So this is ex ante, ex post, in terms of a time measurement. There's the round of societal reproduction, T sub O. The social surplus is Y. And this is the move from A to Q. So in algebra, if social surplus equals Y, therefore Y equals Q minus A. So the total gross output subtracts, with moving the stuff around, the total gross output minus the social necessaries. Now, what does all that mean? The social necessaries and the the total gross output is a means by which we can see a system or a structure or a plane of data that would be defined as social surplus. Now, social surplus is not identical to wealth, but the point is that this is structured as an element of it. Now, the above definition and characterization is purposely vague with respect to the composition. See, this is why it's a measurement problem. The composition of the necessaries, gross output, and social surplus. And below, we return to this definition with more precision. This is a fragment by Carter's of Carter's text. So there's a lot more. The surplus component has been alternatively termed the net product, value added, net productivity, gross profits, and shares of remunerated national income. So it has lots of possibilities with which they're kind of structured, and has been conceived of as the fund from which distributed revenues partake. It is also the source of capital accumulation and growth in subsequent rounds as T+1, T+2 of social reproduction. So here you have all of the kind of elements that we see being developed in volume 2 and volume 3 of Capital. This has been sort of, put together, as it were, in the context of, for example, Sraffa's work. And I think this is a not completely fruitful, but a pretty reasonable way in which one can move forward. So, therefore, let me move to certain things that we're carrying over from the prior chapter. As will be shown below, this particular definition of the labor process can be quite problematic as well, since it may be interpreted as repeating the ahistorical understanding of labor that is characteristic of political economy. Nevertheless, the distinction between labor power and labor process, right? Labor power and labor process, they're by no means identical, plays a crucial role when approaching the question of labor in the attention economy. Now, this is so mainly because it facilitates uncovering the notion of surplus value that lurks it remains hidden for political economy, while the latter conceives the value of attention as the natural effect of the law of supply and demand. A critical approach to the attention economy must examine the way in which attention as labor process, that is, as valorization activity. Now, attention as labor process, that is, as valorization activity, generates a surplus value that is then monetized and turned into profit. Noting, of course, that the first round may not be perfect, but certainly it's the case that this can describe, additional rounds. According to Marx, the lack of a conceptual this is still from chapter 1, the lack of a conceptual distinction between labor power and labor process. Labor process is also described as a sort of lived labor in that sense, inevitably creates the confusion between the value of labor as a commodity bought by the capitalist in the job market and the value created by labor and objectified in the commodity. So these are different, if recall David Harvey's diagrams, this is either stages, these are points on a circuit. They are, as others might describe it, a kind of entry point into the argument that value created by labor and objectified in the commodity. Consequently, political economy treats both as one and the same thing, concealing the fact that there is a difference. That is a surplus between the value of the labor power bought by the capitalist and the value of the commodity produced by the labor process. So this is kind of the parameters, as it were, of subsumption. For Marx, political economy places labor alongside other commodities and hence explains its value through laws and tendencies belonging to the sphere of distribution. Note that there's a sphere of production and a sphere of distribution, Department 1, Department 2, and that, we're trying to see that it is placed, it has a certain contiguity in terms of placing labor alongside other commodities. Now, in doing so, political economy defines the relation between labor and value to be the result of a natural law of supply and demand. Now, it only is natural because it is relatively simple. It depends on certain other elements, the monetizing of lived experience, et cetera, which make things appear natural, but not necessarily are natural in that context. A critique of the attention economy must shift from an understanding of attention as a scarce commodity, and he goes through a wide variety of issues related to a kind of market-driven element where there are supply problems, or so many resources are put together in order to get something, measurable out of it. Now, one needs to sort of look at certain types of network economies, the issue of the introduction of new technology, for example, in the 19th century in telephone companies, and how it is differentiated from a rural versus urban context, among other things. So from the perspective of political economy, attention is not seen as a valorization process, but as a commodity governed by a law of supply and demand, a law intrinsic to the sphere of distribution, not production. In other words, political economy reproduces an unproblematic understanding of the attention economy, which conceals the asymmetric relation between labor and capital that grounds the extortion of surplus value. So this is the whole business here. That is the idea that, Russian advances are done in a kind of, I don't know, opprobrious sort of way, that you have people pitching forward and not taking cover, perhaps. But anyway, rather, it is necessary to understand attention as a quote unquote new form of labor and to unveil the concrete mechanisms of production and extraction of surplus value that make of the attention economy a strictly capitalist phenomenon. Guy spends a lot of ink trying to work through what is derived in the mid 19th century relative to Marx, etc., that help to clarify some of these kinds of issues, or that they're driven to that particular point by prior experience in whatever it is, the bomb factory or whatever. So rather, it's necessary to understand attention as a new form of labor and to unveil the concrete mechanisms of production and extraction of surplus value that make of the attention economy a strictly capitalist phenomenon. And so a bit is spent here on the differences, the kind of palpable differences between males and females, etc. following Jolly and Levant's Marxist terminology and Beller's analysis, it could be argued that Google effectively manages to turn attention into a source of relative surplus value. Attention into a source of relative surplus value. Now, this is controversial in the sense that, there are texts that working on the issues of polymer of such products. Anyway, Pastone's work can be seen mainly as a methodological reflection regarding the category of labor in Marx's work and as a critique of the way this category has been misread by what Pastone calls traditional Marxism. Now, this methodological reinterpretation offers important insight for an imminent critique of the attention economy, since it allows locating attention as a specific form of labor within the historical context of post-industrial capitalism. More precisely, thanks to Pastone's methodological contribution, it is possible to challenge any critique of the attention economy that conceives attention from the perspective of alienated labor. It is in turn possible to propose an alternate analysis of the 19th century between the not yeah not it is in turn possible to propose an alternative analysis of the interrelation between the historical mutations of labor under post-industrial conditions of production and the emergence of attention as a new territory for the production and reproduction of surplus value. Now, as will be shown, this interrelation plays a crucial role for a critique of the attention economy, since it demands a new theoretical framework which can account for the obsolescence of Marx's labor theory of value and the simultaneous persistence of both the category of exchange value and the social relations governed by this category. According to Pastone, most critical analyses of capitalism developed by traditional Marxism have reproduced this trans-historical understanding of labor, considering labor the principle of social constitution and the source of wealth in all societies. In this sense, traditional Marxism poses labor as a universal human essence, and then limits the critique of capitalism to the way in which it alienates this essence. This is why Pastone claims that for traditional Marxism, the problem of capitalism lies not in the way it produces value, but in how it distributes it. Now, that's a kind of important point for a variety of reasons, which also may, in fact, require intervention. Put differently, Pastone claims that traditional Marxism reads Marx using a trans-historical category of labor identical to that of political economy, hence limiting the critique of capitalism to a critique of the distribution of value. Now, this reading is perhaps not as not as widespread. Anyway, just like the work of Jolly and Levant, Beller's attention theory of value presupposes labor as an external standpoint from where to appraise the alienating and exploitative nature of the capitalist mode of production, thus ignoring the fact that both labor and attention are historical categories determined by the transformation of the modes of production. In Beller's 2006 reading of Marx, labor is presented as the universal force behind any social constitution. Quote, it takes labor to build a world, the labor of the masses, close quote, he claims. Adding that what characterizes the attention economy is that this labor becomes exploited through a visual pathway. Hence, the attention economy is explained mainly as the process of alienation on the laborer's suit and, of course, Machiavelli. They only carry one playing quarterback, right? They don't drag the replacement out. Well, need to sort of prove that. So, hence the alienation. Hence the attention economy is explained mainly as a process of alienation of the laborer's sensual labor, an alienation of their human senses. And there's a kind of gap there that, the difference between manipulation of sticks or whatever in comparison with, planes. Well, anyway, for Marx, the limit of political economy is that it projects the abstract category of labor onto non-capitalist societies, concealing its historical specificity and eternalizing the social relations that it attempts to deconstruct. Accordingly, Pastone claims that the methodological error of traditional Marxism is to reproduce the naturalization of the category of labor and to limit the critique of capitalism to the trans-historical standpoint of labor. So, you know, so put differently, Bastone's reinterpretation of Marx can be used to show that the attention economy does not entail a form of labor in general, but a historically specific form of labor that emerges in response to the transformations of the value-labor, the value-labor relation that characterize post-industrial societies. As such, an imminent critique of the attention economy demands a theoretical framework capable of addressing the particularities of the new mechanisms of production and exploitation of value. According to Marx, value has to be understood as the capitalist representation of labor, while labor should be defined as human activity that is both founded on and measured through abstract value. Okay, we proceed further. Marx's labor theory of value relies on the belief that living labor alone is responsible for the production of value. Footnote 2. Machines and technology, on the contrary, create no value. Their only economic function is to reduce the amount of necessary labor time required to produce each commodity, and hence increase the portion of surplus values appropriated by the capitalist. All righty. Marxist labor theory of value relies on the belief that living labor alone is responsible for the production of value. Machines and technology, on the contrary, create no value. Machines and tech, on the contrary, create no value. Their only economic function is to reduce the amount of necessary labor time required to produce every commodity, and hence increase the portion of surplus value appropriated by the capitalist. Technological development in the field of communication and transportation likewise creates no value, but merely accelerates the circulation time of commodities, thus shortening the time between the production of surplus value in the labor process and its realization in the market. And that's kind of the normal path, right? Now, it's useful to note that Marx's analysis of machines is mainly influenced by two theoretical frameworks. Number one, a theory of simple mechanic machines, and a number two, theory of heat engines and thermodynamics. Now, according to the first one, a machine consists of three parts: the motor mechanism, the transmitting mechanism, and finally the tool or working power of ammunitions. In Marx's work, this definition of machinery is combined with a second concept based on the novel, at the time, theory of thermodynamics. And unless you think that that's unimportant, I think it's possible to make certain arguments about thermodynamic modeling. But anyway, following this theory, Marx interpreted the labor process in terms of inputs and outputs of energy, which means that the relation between labor and value is one of transmission of energy between living labor and objectified value. By combining these two general theories, Marx defined a machine as objectified labor, that is fixed capital, which despite replacing a fragment of living labor in the production process, could not in itself generate new activities, that is value, couldn't make its own, make huge jeffels one way or the other. And all right, back to the text. The contention that machines generate no value leads Marx to identify a paradoxical tendency in capitalism. Capitalism tries to replace living labor with machines in order to reduce costs and increase profit. Yet, at the same time, each fragment of the productive process that is replaced by machines with machines ceases to generate surplus value, since, according to Marx's labor theory of value, surplus value is only produced by exploiting living labor, thus decreasing the total rate of profit and demanding the constant counteraction of capital. In volume 3 of Capital, the book, Marx suggests that one way in which capitalists counteract this tendency is by inventing an even larger amount of surplus value in acquiring more technology, hoping this will increase productivity and with it also the return of profit. That's a complicated set of assumptions. The result of this, however, is that the ratio between living labor and productivity keeps decreasing, causing, in Marx's prediction, an unavoidable crisis. It could be argued that their post-Fordism realizes Well, we'll continue this anon, and we'll get back to this. Thank you for your attention.